Welcome to all of you here. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Ed Hallrath. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for the Program in Biology, and I'm also the Program Coordinator for the Advance-CTR Award, and Jim Hadley, Senior Clint, is the PI that award. So we're kicking off the first seminar of this new academic year, and it's going to be a special presentation focused on community engagement. But before I get into that, I just want to remind everyone that this seminar is being recorded and downstream, live streamed to the Zoom audience. And so I wanted to remind the speakers that it would be helpful to repeat any questions that you get from the audience, because this is the microphone that is being used for the broadcast through the live streaming. And that also we will have the opportunity to have questions come in from the Zoom audience. And so folks in the admin core will be monitoring those, and if any come in, we'll be able to convey those to you. And finally, in terms of housekeeping, I encourage everyone to complete the survey that was handed out. It was available here in the room, and also those folks who are out there in Zoom land will be getting an email or an outreach of a online survey to complete. With that completed, let me say that I'd like to welcome our speakers, Jacquelyn, Fede, and Nunn. We're going to be talking today about the community engagement studios concept, a structured approach to obtaining meaningful feedback from stakeholders to inform your research. So Jacquelyn Fede will kick things off. She's a PhD assistant research professor of psychology at the University of Rhode Island and a research associate on our Advance-CTR award. And Amy Nunn, here is a Doctor of Science, associate professor of public health and medicine at Brown University and executive director of the Rhode Island Public Health Institute. Originally, we had hoped that Sharon Rounds would be able to participate as well. She attended the event that sort of kicked this off in terms of a community engagement studio run through that was done at the University of Connecticut, but she's not available to attend now. But if anyone wants to get any additional information from her perspective, feel free to reach out to her. So with that, I will turn things over to Jacquelyn.
Well, thank you, Ed. I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you about community engagement studios. A little bit of a background information for you. Over the summer, myself and Amy and Sharon attended a training at the University of Connecticut, their Center for Food Policy and Obesity. It was a training put on by Vanderbilt University, their medical center, and they're one of the pioneers of community engagement studios. So we went to this 1.5-day training where we learned all about this process, and we also got the opportunity to see a live community engagement studio in action that day. So I am here to report back on what we learned, what they are, what they look like, what they are not. And I've tried really hard to structure this as a bit of a community engagement studio. To give you an example, I'm going to present an idea to you about something that we think could be really powerful for research in Rhode Island, something that we could potentially set up and have available to researchers here. And then towards the end, I've tried to leave about 15 to 20 minutes to have an open discussion, to get your thoughts, ideas that pop into your head, barriers you foresee, and questions you have about the process. So that's how we will run today. I'm joined here by Amy Nunn. I will be taking the lead on the presentation, but she might chime in at any point if I have forgotten something key, and she will certainly join me in the facilitated discussion at the end to help answer any questions. So with that, let us begin. We're talking about translational research, right? We're talking about getting research findings from the lab, from our bedside, into our community members' hands, so to speak. And we know that engaging communities in research increases its relevance, and it may speed up translation, right? Because you might have the best idea or the best device, the best technology, the best way of doing things, but if your community cannot access it or really has no use for something that you thought was awesome, it's not going to move down the spectrum of translation, and you're going to wonder what happened to this great idea. So engaging community members along the way, we know is a good idea. That's a pretty universal thing. But what are some of the common methods for engaging community members? People can shout things out if they want. Surveys, advisory boards, that one person you know from that one group, right? Too often, we just use one perspective from one person we know, one patient we talk to. Advertisements, looking up someone's social media account, right? It's really a very one and done process too often. They're used for some kind of information, participation, time, effort, translation. In this case, I'm talking about they're translating your materials from English into another language. They're giving you ideas, advice, guidance, and they're getting nothing. They're not consulted again. There's no report back of the results to the community member. They don't know that any actions have been taken, even if you have taken what they've said into consideration. It's a single time point of feedback, and there's really no benefit to the community that they are aware of, right? So we know this, and I think that many researchers want to do this. I think that researchers know this is a good idea and buy into the idea that if they engage a community member or a community or their patients along their way in their research, it probably will be more powerful and more relevant, right? But there are barriers. So what are some of the barriers? I bet we can name a bunch of barriers as well. Things that might stop you from doing this. Time. Effort. Know-how, right? Feeling like you don't even know how to enter into a community. Access. Who's the right community member? What age group of the community? Am I using the right language? I would love to go engage the community, but you know what? I got this grant and I just need to publish on it because that's the limitation that's been put on me. There are lots of barriers to getting this done, even if you agree that it is a good idea. So community engagement studios, they're just one way that you can engage a community, right? There's many ways that you could do it ethically and with high validity and to help inform your research in a respectful and acceptable way. This is just one of them, but it is a nice structured program that facilitates project-specific input from community and patient stakeholders, and it can enhance your research design, your methods, the protocols, the measures, the materials, right? It can influence your implementation of your study, how you go about it, what are the procedures, what are the processes at recruitment when you're carrying out the study. Dissemination, once you have those results, who are you reporting to? How are you reporting it? How many times? In what forum? By what means? And certainly, it can help to inform research from the very beginning before you're even at the stage of designing. It can be this kind of open-ended question of what things matter to the community that research should focus upon. And what does this look like? And of course, I will go into more details of what this really looks like, but it's a forum of community experts to guide research at any and all stages, like we saw in the previous slide. It's face-to-face feedback and guidance from those that your research seeks to serve. And it's a place, it's a studio. I think studio is a great name for this because it is two groups of people on an equal playing field. If anything, the community members are the experts and you are there to learn from them. So this is a forum where you can make critical mistakes before they really matter. You can put that survey in the hands of community members and learn at a critical time point that these questions are insensitive to the culture to which you'll be administering the survey. Before you go ahead and do that, and later on, no one's responded to your survey or you didn't get the information you expected. So it is a judgment-free zone if it is run properly, a place to trial your ideas and put them before the people you wish to engage. Many benefits. Again, the name studio is important because it is this collaborative effort between the researcher and the community members, and both sides benefit. And that's what's different about some of those examples we gave in the beginning, where you're just asking one time and never going back into the community. So for the researcher, you'll see that there's really no special skills or training needed. Certainly, you will get coached by a community engagement studios team, but the time that is put in on the front end for what it could save you in the end is very minuscule. It's quick and easy. You get immediate input, and that's relative because there is a process here, and it does take some time to build up the meeting, but once you have that meeting, you have really usable, relevant input for your study. It's a unique opportunity. You often get unexpected benefits and learn things that maybe you weren't even expecting going into it. And again, it's low cost. The cost benefit of making those mistakes early or learning early rather than later is huge. And then even more importantly, for our community members, they get to bring back information to the community. This can help change the image that research has in our communities, the trust that is lacking. If community members are more often being engaged and talking face-to-face with researchers and seeing that their ideas are being used, that changes how they tell people about research in the community. And that's a very positive thing. So bringing back information to the community about research and what it's really like, hey, I actually sat down and talked to this researcher who's interested in studying heart disease in our community, and he's gonna come back and tell us what happened, and he's gonna offer us advice on how we can get in and get these screenings, and et cetera. So it gets people excited about research rather than hesitant and scared, which they have a right to be given the past of research in the community. We have to try to change that. They get to have their voice heard, influence research, and if this is something that is interesting to them and that they have a good time doing and find that it's a passion of theirs, they can engage in these studios multiple times for those studios that they meet the criteria. So it allows for them to get into other areas of research and continue being engaged in the process. So this is a very important slide as well. What a community engagement studio is not. It's not research. A community engagement studio is not research. They are not considered to be focus groups or qualitative research, advisory boards, community-based participatory research, action research or participatory action research. They're not a recruiting tool. That's very, very important. You don't get to go to a community engagement studio and assume, great, these are 10 people that I'm going to automatically get to enroll in my clinical trial. If they approach you after because they're genuinely interested and want to participate, that's fine, but the community engagement studio is not a recruiting tool. It's not a needs assessment or program evaluation, and it's not human subjects research, right? Like we said in the beginning, it's a studio where people are on equal playing field to collaborate and discuss ideas and throw around ideas and get feedback and get input from the community. It's that practice field to put your ideas out there and make those mistakes before they matter. IRB approval is not needed for a community engagement studio. If this was something that we started here and did here, local IRBs would be informed of the process, and we would approach them and say, here's why we should be exempt when we do these things. They are not research. If anything, they should be something that strengthen your IRB application to say, this is the procedure that I'm proposing, and I've already run it by a panel of community experts who could be potential participants in this study and who are the people for whom I'm doing this research. So it is not research, it is a tool of research, it is a collaborative forum, and it's really a partnership more than anything. So that's very important to keep in mind. So I'm sure in your mind, you might already be thinking about things, if you've had a panel of community experts from your field, from your area in front of you, that you might be able to ask them or that you would want to discuss with them. Are my research questions of value to the community? How feasible are my study procedures for my participants? Are my materials, forms, surveys understandable and culturally appropriate? What are the most effective and respectful ways to recruit participants? How should I go about getting my findings out to community members? And I have funding for X. What kinds of questions should I be asking? Or I'm thinking about writing a grant application in this topic area. What should my aims look like? What are your top aims? So community engagement studios, they can benefit a project at any stage. It's really important to note, though, that the earlier on that you engage the community, the better. They're most effective for planning and like your overall design, because by the time you've already run a survey or put a survey out there or started into your procedures, anything you learn from the community is going to be harder to change at that point, right? You can't often go into the middle of a study and say, oh, I'm changing this whole procedure right now. It doesn't work that way. So the earlier on in the process that you can engage the community, the better. But any of these questions could be used in a community engagement study. Any questions for clarification so far? This is a hard. Yeah, sure.
I think the other thing that may be important to note is that this can also be, most of these examples are about precursors to research, but this can also be a useful tool for disseminating the findings and getting community feedback about what you learned and interpreting study findings.
Yeah, so Amy has added that in addition to these questions, which are more at the front end of the research design, if you've carried out a study, you've done everything, and you have your results, a hugely important part can be, how do I get these out there to people who can use them in real time? So that, and that's obviously key to translational understanding. Thank you. Yes, in the back. Judy.
Is it possible to use these studios for results interpretation? By that I mean, like, say you've done, you have some qualitative data, and it's like, I'm not understanding what these mean, or I'm doing a validity check with the community for those results or their interpretation of what these mean.
Yes, so the question is it possible to use these in the interpretation of your results or as a check on how you have interpreted your findings? And the answer is yes, it's definitely possible. It's one of the rarer things that people use them for, just based on a survey that I'll show you at the end. But yes, absolutely, it's a possibility to do that. Was there one more hand? Three more? Okay, in the back first.
Along those lines, we're planning one of these for a diabetes project with where
Yep.
we'll be getting some of our preliminary data, and then we're going to ask the next steps related to prevention. I hope that sounds like too much for you, but the plan is to get their feedback on one, the results, and what should the next steps be.
I think that would be totally feasible and a great use of a community engagement studio. I'm sorry, yes, repeat the question, thank you. So the question is, there are plans to do a community engagement studio with a diabetes related study at Brown, and they are planning to engage the community when they have their findings and in planning the intervention based on the findings. I think absolutely, and that you'll probably get some of the interpretation of those results in there, and then how does that translate into action steps that can actually be used by your community? So yes, definitely. We'll go out to the other side here.
What is the difference between this and a community advisory?
The question is, what is the difference between this and a community advisory board? So a community engagement studio, the group will generally range from 6 to 12 participants. They are tailored exactly to your needs. So if my study, and I'll show you a few examples later on, if my study requires that I have members from communities of color that are over 50 and who have smoked for more than 25 years, those are the people that we're going to be engaging for this one-time studio to get direct input for your study. Whereas a community advisory board is usually a little broader, meets regularly, maybe just trying to have their pulse on the issue going along. This is really targeted to your study. And yes.
The other way I would think about it is this is a structured one-time conversation that I usually think about community advising boards. It's a group that's giving you an ongoing dialogue and conversation. This is a structured, usually 1 to 3 hour session.
The added input by Amy was that community engagement studios are a structured one-time facilitated conversation, usually from 1 to 3 hours in length, whereas a community advisory board is ongoing and what's the other thing?
Ongoing dialogue.
Ongoing dialogue, thank you. Okay, one more, just because it's Dr. Packard, and then I'm gonna carry on. Because I am leaving time at the end for more of this discussion, and I want you to see what they really look like and just some examples of how they can.
So isn't one of the knocks in the community is that we go out with our ideas? This still feels rather etheric. Instead, you may be coming to this, but instead of going out to the community and soliciting their ideas, this is soliciting feedback on something that we've generated. I don't know whether that's a fair assessment, but that when I read about the criticism of community research, we're going out and it still feels that way. More etheric than that.
Sorry about that. The question is, oftentimes one of the main criticisms of researchers going out to the community is that we go in and
With our ideas.
with our ideas up front, and we are kind of imposing those ideas on the community. And this feels similar to that. And I will say that there are things that certainly have to be paid attention to in the planning of these studios and how you carry them out to ensure that it is less like that. The way that the questions are structured are very open-ended, and although you are trying to get specific information that you need, there's also a lot of room for the community panel to really thrive and lead the conversation. In addition, there are things embedded within the process that I think make it more apparent that the community voice is really being heard, and I will touch on some of those. And as a note, I would say after the community engagement, if I'm coaching a researcher, I'm always going to tell them, write to this panel and tell them, thank you, and exactly the ways that you will be changing the study, and did I hear you right? So I think we can structure in multiple time points and really structure them in a way that does get away from that more so. But certainly if you don't do it well, it can turn into just that. So it's a good point. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because A, it's very hard to read. It's straight from Vanderbilt University's training protocol. It's really to show you, here's an overall process of what might happen. And I'm going to talk about each one of these steps for a little bit. So if this was something that were to be implemented, perhaps the first step would be to have some sort of mechanism where a researcher could put in a request for service. It could be at the pre-research stage. It could be post-research once you have your results and your findings. It really can be at any stage of the research. But a general request would be put in about what it is they need to get from the community. And then there would be a planning stage, some preparation between the community engagement studio team and the researcher, the actual community engagement studio meeting, and the outcomes and any follow-up that is necessary. And again, I will talk a little bit about each one of those. So in this request and planning phase, who's involved and in what roles? The researcher puts in their request, whatever it is they think they want. The first thing that happens is that the community engagement team will try to work with the researcher to get at what is that information that's really critical to get out of this community engagement studio. And they'll give them some guidance on the fact that they will have to prepare a presentation for this meeting. So start working on a 10 to 15 minute presentation to give an idea to your community members about what it is you're doing and why you're seeking their input.
Who
There's-
makes up that team?
The question is, who makes up the community engagement studio team? That would be decided upon if we do it. If Advance-CTR was to do it, it would be members of the brand, from Brown, URI, the local community, people who have some kind of expertise in community engagement. And then also, it was really critical on Vanderbilt's team to have people who were not so much in academia, but community leaders who helped train facilitators and be a part of more of the meeting stage of things. So it doesn't have to be a large team, but it's a diverse team in terms of the skill set. Good question. So meanwhile, as the researcher is preparing, the community engagement studio team is doing background research on the topic. They're building that community panel of experts. They're prepping a neutral facilitator, and they're figuring out the logistics. Where can we have this meeting? When can we have it? Lining up the schedules. I will say that Vanderbilt was adamant that when they do this, it is the principal researcher who must be the one who is involved at every step here. It can't be your assistant or someone who's beneath you. It is the principal researcher who will be doing most of the work. If that person can't commit to the time of the community engagement studio, they would not do it, because it's a show of respect to the community, really. So that was critical for them, something to consider. And certainly I wanted to address here too, this panel of community experts. Where does that come from? Vanderbilt has been doing this for years now, and their database had over upper hundreds of community members that had participated in an engagement studio at some point that they could pull from. That would also be something that has to be built and maintained and engaged along the way by the community engagement studios team. As we carry on in the process, more preparation occurs. The researcher further works with that community engagement studios team, preparing their slides and presentation, putting it in language that makes sense. They said a lot of times it was taking out a lot of text from the presentations that needed to happen. Coaching the researcher, even something as simple as, we're not in academia. You come to this meeting and throw on your jeans and your polo. Don't show up in a full suit and like you own the place. Another important thing was that they minimized who came to that studio to just that principal researcher. They did not want a band of people coming in, and it's intimidating to have a group of researchers come in rather than we're going to sit down at the table with this one researcher and have a discussion. So they tried to avoid having this pack of researchers kind of overtake the forum. What else? Anything I missed there? Just prepping that facilitator. There's a person who will facilitate the community engagement studio who is not part of the research team, who is not a member of the community. So they are a neutral facilitator. So getting them any necessary background information and informing them of what are the questions that we need to touch on in this meeting. Right, the exciting part. What does a community engagement studio actually look like when we go and do it? It's approximately 2 hours, 1 to 3 hour range. They try as much as they can to tell the community members it will last for this long, just to be respectful of their time. Lunch or dinner or breakfast, I suppose, could be served. You eat together. So the first part of any community engagement studio is that there is food available, and part of the researcher's coaching is that when you get there and the food's there, don't go in the corner and talk to that one person from the community engagement studio team that you know. Have a seat at the table and start establishing yourself as there to learn from the community. So having a meal is a great way to put people on that same even playing field as we go. We know, right? A meal does wonders. In the beginning of the meeting, once people have eaten a little bit, there will be about a 10 to 15 minute researcher presentation. And this is the presentation that the Community Engagement Studios team has worked with the researcher to formulate. And that presentation should provide the necessary background information. If there's important limitations or areas that we really can't get into that are coming from that grant you're working on, you want to inform the panel beforehand so we don't go off on tangents. And you want to end with what it is you hope to get out of the session, what information you seek from the community experts. Following that presentation, there is a facilitated discussion. Like I said, these studios tend to have about 6 to 12 participants. The questions that are asked are agreed upon by the CES team and the researcher beforehand. And as we mentioned earlier, these questions should be left open-ended enough that they can be community expert driven. You don't want your questions to be so specific and so imposing with your own ideas that communities are pigeonholed into a topic. You want the discussion to flow where it should, because where they take your questions is just as important as what they say in response to them. The stakeholder feedback is recorded, but it's not recorded via audio or video. We're lucky today because we're doing video, but I think a critical point is that a note taker is involved in this process, and it is not a note taker sitting there tapping away on their laptop, but there are giant post-it easel board things on the wall, and this note taker is writing as the studio goes along. And I think that was a good message to send, that we are taking down all this information and we're putting it out there in front of you as we're writing it down. So if clarification is needed, we can do that on the spot. If I've misinterpreted what you've said, you see it right here and you can tell me. So it's a transparency thing. Rather than one person who kind of holds the power of the note taking and is interpreting through their lens what's being said. Yes, Amy's going to add something.
I just want to add one thing that's important that to mention, and that is that this is a little bit akin to a focus group for those people that have done qualitative research before. What distinguishes it is that you cannot consider this data because you have not consented or engaged anyone in human subjects research. So when it's recorded, it's a written document. The way it's recorded, it is not transcribed and it's not digitally, and there's no audio recording, and that is not allowed because you haven't consented people to research. So that is one of the real distinguishing characteristics between this and qualitative data collection. So it feels like a focus group or a community forum with a whole lot of notes. So that was illustrative when we observed it for me to see that it's kind of structured like a focus group in the engagement, but you are not allowed to record. And that is just because that is, I think, the most important thing that distinguishes this from human subject research as kind of defined by NIH.
That's a great point. I'm just going to recap that first and then I'll come over to you. Amy added that it starts to look a lot like a focus group, but one of the most important defining factors is that they are writing out the notes, they are not recording, they are not allowed to record or have audio or video recordings of them because you have not consented these participants in the process. It is not human subjects research. So it's one of the most important defining features is that live note taker rather than someone transcribing on a laptop or video recording.
And the other thing, just as a follow-on, sorry, but I think this is really important. You cannot use this information and report on it as data in a peer-reviewed article. You can note that you engaged the community and that you provided feedback. You cannot present this. This is kind of what the NIH has decided. Okay? So this is, I think, important for people who might do this, who are engaged in human subject research or who want to use this technique. This is not a research method. This is a way to get feedback on your ideas. It's not appropriate to present the information as data for a study. It's preparatory to a study, or you might be getting feedback about your results, but this is not considered scientific data. And I think that's it. So I asked, in our training, how do you present this in an article? And they often say, well, we had a studio. And what we learned was A, B, and C, but if you would imagine that would probably appear me, the biggest difference that I observed for this versus what we would call formative qualitative, where we have focus group interviews where you get community feedback.
So Amy added more emphasis that, and this is very important, when you carry out a community engagement studio, you cannot go publishing those results as results. They can be mentioned in your methods. You can talk about the fact that you used the community engagement studio to engage your patients or your stakeholders, but the information you gather from them is to inform your research. It is not part of the results that you report out on. You can't turn them into the participants of your study, essentially. And that's also, she emphasized, that's coming from the NIH. That is their standard, so that's very important to keep in mind.
Do you pay the participants of these studios?
Yes.
What's the going rate?
So after the studio, the question was, do you pay the participants in the studio? Yes. They did pay the participants. Community experts were paid $25 an hour for about a 2-hour studio. Each person is coming away with about $50. So we treat them as community consultants, essentially. And after that studio takes place, the expert feedback is summarized. So all those notes that were taken, and the researcher and the community engagement studios team will meet to discuss what information was obtained. Is everyone on the same page? Is it clear the information that was obtained? Is there any need to follow up with community members to get any kind of clarification on things that were said or that aren't seeming as clear in the aftermath of the meeting? And then once everyone agrees that they're on the same page with actionable items for that researcher, ideally that researcher implements the changes. So that's structurally what it looks like. And I will do a few just live looks, some examples that have been done. In a second, I have I think a Zoom question. Sure. The question was, is the note taker someone from the research team or the CES team? It is from the CES team. And I think it could be someone who's with the neutral facilitator or outside of the researcher in some way, but it is not someone from the researchers team. Good question. Good on Zoom? Just to give you some ideas of things that have been done, and these are as reported by Vanderbilt. The effect of, I'm a psychology person, so maple citrate on insulin resistance was the study. This researcher was an assistant professor of clinical pharmacology. Their specific request at the time was recruitment and retention, help with recruitment and retention. And the Community Engagement Studios team built a panel of 7 African American women who provided feedback on hiring more diverse staff for the study, changing their recruitment materials because these materials were not culturally sensitive, changing the protocol to reduce barriers to participation, and importantly, the changes were made and the project was completed with 100% retention. Now, 100% retention is rare, certainly, but I think doing something like this where you're getting that information up front increases the likelihood that you can get closer to 100%. Biomarker for early lung cancer detection, another example. This was an associate professor of medicine and cancer biology. Wanted help with recruitment and consent processes. The Community Engagement Studio team built a panel of 10 people. See, this is where I got that example from. 10 African-American people over the age of 50 and who had been smokers for more than 25 years. Their feedback included having appropriate incentives and referrals for uninsured people who come to their study, shortening the consent form, and increasing the font size. Minor details can matter. Addressing transportation barriers to participation. I think in this one, the overall process, the community panel thought was pretty good, but they thought people would have a very hard time actually getting there to enroll. And this seems very broad that the changes were made, but the only information available is that that researcher did make all the changes suggested by the community engagement studio team. Let's do one more. Do one more live look, and then I will move on. There is another one in here, but I think these slides will be posted up so you can check it out. I want to save time for ourselves. This was a design. So this was planning a design for an ICU survivor clinic. This was an assistant professor of medicine who was looking for help with their intervention design. Great. Their panel was 8 ICU survivors and their caregivers. And this panel offered suggestions like offer lists of community resources available, educate caregivers on markers of recovery, train providers to handle more psychosocial symptoms. And this group was able to submit that grant to get funding for this design, and they were able to create this ICU recovery center. So it's not, I know, correlation does not equal causation. It's not to say that a community engagement studio will guarantee you a grant and a center, but you can see from understanding what a community engagement studio looks like, how it can help you in the process and how it can help you design it in a way that will actually be feasible and usable to your participants or your stakeholders. And I will skip over this one for time. So Vanderbilt, and this would be an important part of our process too, I believe. Vanderbilt also does a evaluation survey. They check back in with their research to see, you got all this feedback from your experts, what did you do with it, what happened, and how was this community engagement studio process for you? So they also surveyed community experts for some of the items. Here they ask, the input provided by the community experts will improve the quality of the research. And when community experts were polled, 69% strongly agreed and 30% agreed. When researchers were polled, 88% strongly agreed and 12% agreed. So on both sides, overall, there's positive feelings that something will happen as a product of doing this studio. This slide is hard to see, but Vanderbilt asked, what do you plan to do or what do you plan to change as a result of the feedback you receive from the community engagement studio? The number one answer, and you probably can't read this and it's cut off, but the level of community and patient engagement in research going forward. So not just for this study, but researchers, I think, tended to see the value of doing this for all their studies and everything they do. And other things like recruitment and retention, research design, dissemination. Again, it's at every phase of the study that researchers were planning changes as a result for these studios. Less frequent, but still there. You see up there data interpretation, things we talked about earlier. So a broad range of things that can come from community engagement studios. So that is an overall, an introduction of what a community engagement studio is and some of the ways they've been used by other groups. I would love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. What are your questions, your thoughts and reactions, feedback, ideas? You're thinking of giving one, you have an idea for when you want to run it by a group. And importantly, if you foresee barriers or challenges in carrying out something like this, the floor is yours, and I would love to field questions with the help of Amy. Amy, do you want to come up here so that, just to save time, if you give an answer, you can go right into the microphone. Yeah.
I had a couple of questions. Is it the studio team that identifies the people in the community and recruits the people who come to the studio and participate?
Yeah. So the question is it the studio team that identifies the people from the community and recruits them to come participate in the meeting? Yes, the answer is yes. And the community engagement studio team also handles the logistics of the room that it's going to be held in, the food that will be coming, and those kinds of details as well.
About how long does it take, or has the experience been, from the time that the researcher and the team meet to the time where this particular thing occurs?
I think it takes, they feel like they, oh, how long does the prep take from start to finish? I think usually a month to 6 weeks. It depends on how easily you can find people that are willing and able to participate. The other thing I just want to add about the previous question about who picks the community members, the researcher scholar is invited to get feedback. So some, as you can imagine, there's like a spectrum of how much people engage with community members. So if the researcher already does that, they'll welcome feedback. But a lot of times the people that solicit the assistance with the studio are people for whom that's kind of less familiar or less comfortable. So it's kind of a platform to demystify that, I think, and take down that barrier that some people might feel about where to get started to get constructive community input.
And my last question was, depending on the type of people that you're drawing from, which communities of interest you have, do you ever then go back, do you take a neutral place to hold the meeting, or you go into someone's home and hold the meeting?
The way that, I don't think they ever go into anyone's home. I'm sorry, but where do you do this? The Vanderbilt is really considered best practice for this. There are a couple of other places around the country that also do it well. We met some of those folks too, like in University of Chicago. And they have dedicated staff time and space and institutional support for it. And they're putting in hard money for this so that they have dedicated spaces for these things at the university. The other thing that I think is important to share that maybe we didn't touch on yet is what's kind of the staffing and resource requirements for this. So you want a really, there is considerable kind of administrative time leading up to this. So they have 2 people that really coordinate this, that's overseen by kind of a community engagement scholar at Vanderbilt. That's their staffing pattern. So they have a scholar that dedicates a chunk of their time to it. They have a full-time person who often serves as a moderator, though not always, because sometimes it's important to have a moderator from the community. So they have contract moderators that they work with that may be useful for facilitating some conversations. And then they have a note taker whose job is to kind of oversee the participatory part of the note taking. And then that team also synthesizes the information and coordinates the communication back and forth with the researcher and the community. It's like a 3-person team. 2 full-time people essentially, and 1 scholar who oversees this from kind of a scientific level.
Question from Zoom. And the other is asking, is there a part of the community engagement studio where the feedback is provided back to the community experts after the studio?
Yeah, so the question is there a part of the community engagement studio where the feedback is really reported back to the community members after it's been interpreted? I think there are several ways you can do this, but yes, once action steps are agreed upon, or the community engagement studios team and the researcher have decided what they think are the important things that came from the meeting, it is sent back out to the people who participated for a check to say, here's what we heard. Did we misunderstand you? Did we miss anything? And also an opportunity for the researcher to provide thanks to the panel of experts for contributing to their research, and hopefully a plan to re-engage with the community to say, after I do this or after I make these changes, I'll also tell you what happens and what comes of it, or solicit your insight again. I don't know if they have standard protocol other than that.
I think they usually issue a report that's a synopsis of the finding, and they also keep that on the record in their database.
Another person is also asking how the facilitators,
The facilitators,
How they're trained.
just in seeing how it worked for Vanderbilt, they have a person that I think could really moderate almost anything. She seemed amazing because she oversaw the training session, and she was just a great facilitator. And she has a book of, it seems like, I don't know, like 20 people that she often calls on from the community for different types of topics, and also from different communities. And those people are often kind of well-versed in facilitation, but also in an issue or have some background and history with the communities of interest. And she said that that was one of her biggest challenges was when she knew she needed an outside facilitator, someone from a different racial or ethnic background, or someone who understood the culture better than she did, that she was pretty candid about that sometimes she felt like when she wanted to outsource something, they didn't often have the exact right person. So one of the, I think, delicate pieces is understanding what to do internally and what to outsource to an outside consultant for the moderation.
And she did mention that it was probably one of her weaknesses that she has really, really high standards. And so she's not always sure if it's the fact that she doesn't know if they're a good match or she'd just rather do it herself. It's a kind of a control thing too. But yeah, it's definitely a tough balance there, and something that you would have to really observe as the CES team and keep a strong group of facilitators.
I think just to give a concrete example that she gave is that they were facilitating a conversation about transgender health, and she knew that she always has and probably always will stumble with pronouns even in spite of her best intentions, and that communities had told her, hey, that's offensive, and she had become aware of that, but also knew that it was her weakness, and not because she intended to discriminate against anyone, but because she literally would struggle with the grammar. And she said, so I learned, don't ever do that again. You should outsource that to someone who has more cultural competence in dealing with sexual and gender minorities. And similarly with working with other racial groups. She felt very comfortable, for example, which is a white lady working with the African American community, but also felt that they had hired bilingual moderators when they needed to reach out to the Hispanic community in Nashville. Those are some examples that she gave. Jim?
There's one behind you too.
No, I defer.
Okay.
So looking for your feedback on this, when we're planning for the diabetes project I described, we surveyed both providers and patients. Our plan was to bring providers and patients together under a communication studio to elicit feedback on this type of intervention. I don't know if that drives all of you or there's power dynamics in your estimation, but that's sort of our plan.
She asked, should we put patients and providers in a room together for a studio? And my instinct as a qualitative methodologist would be to say, it depends on what you want to hear. If you want them to reach consensus, maybe it's good to get them together, but if you feel like there may be a power dynamic, then perhaps not. But sometimes it's good to bring people in a room together so that they listen to one another. So that's, I think you always have to weigh the pros and cons. What do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking along similar lines. I think you have to be careful of just bringing them together and whose voice is heard and who's doing most of the talking, and you have to attend to that if you're going to bring them together. However, if it's a tight-knit group in a small community already, it might be a place where they're going to really work some things out amongst themselves, and that could be valuable too. So I think defining the goals and letting that lead, whether you put them together or not. It might be the case that it's worth it to do them separately, and then once you have feedback from each, bring a few representatives together to discuss what was found in each one of those studios, if you have the time and resources to do it.
Yeah. One other thing I want to add that I think was super important for my learning is the business model. So I asked, because I do a lot of community engagement research, I talk a lot of qualitative research, but what's your business model? And there were 3 different groups represented, 2 in person and 1 that's just kind of known for best practices. They all had different business models. So at Vanderbilt, how do you pay for this? Because, it's expensive. Not expensive, but there are costs associated with doing this, food and the staffing. So I was really interested in thinking, how can we do this at Brown? What's the business model? So at Vanderbilt, this is completely covered by institutional resources. So, and I think that they're also recognized as really the best practice. So the university covers this in total and in its entirety. At Utah, they charge the investigators And my understanding, I believe that they said that they have a sliding scale based on seniority, so that investigators that have more grant support actually are charged a fee for this service, and others that may be just kind of more at the beginning of their career at the postdoc or assistant professor level pay less. And I think the University of Chicago had a hybrid model, so that they did have some institutional support and then also like
Writing it into grants.
right. They encouraged it, but I think didn't make it required or something like that. I can't remember, but I think there are different ways that these kinds of things can be paid for. I think the most expensive components are really the space, the food, and then the staff that conduct the community engagement studios.
Yes,
Is there somebody else?
Marcella has one, and you have one. You've both already gone, so you can fight it out amongst
I-
yourselves.
I was not raised in a barn.
Go ahead, Jim.
Why don't y'all ask a question?
Yeah, come on.
All right, so this is demystified, except where do you get the community participation? That's just,
I was just gonna ask.
that's still mysterious to me. So I was thinking, well, we've had great experiences with the Square Center, and they've got this community advisory. But all those people are leaders of different. And are leaders community, is there implicit bias in that? And still see this.
The question is, where are we getting these community members from? We have a running partnership with Square Center, and there's a lot of community leaders there, but not as many. Who is the community? Where are we getting these people from? And the answer is it's both. So many of the examples that were given were people in the community, patients, ICU survivors, LGBTQ
But how do you
youth.
find them? It's not like
It's
a jury pool.
No. It's been, how do you find them? It's been built over years in these relationships. Of course, it started small and grew and grew and grew. But the community engagement studio that we observed was actually with operators of food pantries in the state of Connecticut. So they were at a slightly different level than someone who is a teenager who identifies as transgender. So yes, they are, of course, coming at this from a point where they've been doing it for much longer, and they've built up, I think it is in the upper hundreds to low thousands of people in the community who are willing to participate in these studios.
These are friendly.
It was friendly.
There's
Friendly
a
fire.
database, and there's a lot of cold calls. So the coordinators, the people who oversee this under the PI, half of their job is to be out in the community and building relationships. And then also you have to pick someone who's willing to pick up the phone and cold call an agency that they may or may not have a relationship with, that ask them if they would be willing to facilitate a dialogue with any of their clients or their contacts. So I think that that's just something important to think about in terms of the staffing.
I was just going to add, in my experience, when I was part, or I am part of co-leader for the Community Engagement Corps for the Superfund, it was a matter of years to being able to identify who was out there doing, or potential stakeholders, and establishing those relationships. I know the work that I do with the Narragansett tribe, I mean, I worked a year and a half to 2 years before I could even start my research.
Just an emphasis from the audience that engaging members of the community and really finding out who is out there, how to contact them, getting in touch and building that trust can be a full-time job in and of itself, and certainly something that has to be considered in this process. The question is social media used at all as a recruiting tool? I'm not sure that we touched on that. I'm sure that there are forums for it, like when you're going out to youth and when you're going out to certain communities, and I'm sure they do it, but it's just not something that we really covered in that training. But I'm sure it's a tool that can be leveraged, yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think an important thing with the cold calling is it allows you to give a little more context and information as to who you are and what you're really doing this for, whereas those ads on Facebook and social media can kind of look like, yeah, especially for someone who doesn't trust research to begin with. So I think it has to be with the right community. If there are no other questions, and certainly please reach out to us if you think of anything else or if there's anything else you want clarification on. I just want to thank Advance-CTR for sending us over there, the UConn Center, Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity for hosting the training, and Vanderbilt University Medical Center for carrying out the training over the summer. It's a great experience. And thank you all for coming and hearing about community engagement studios today. And thank you, Amy and Sharon, for your support as well. Good job, guys.